George Stinney Jr. is the youngest person in the United States to ever be put to death in the electric chair. He was executed in the Deep South in 1944, in the midst of the Jim Crow era. George lived in the racially segregated town of Alcolu, South Carolina, where white people and black people were separated by a set of railroad tracks. On March 24, 1944, two white girls, Mary Emma Thames and Betty June Binnicker, aged 7 and 11, went missing and were later found in a soggy ditch, badly beaten with fatal blows to their skulls. The ditch was on the property of George Burke Sr., a prominent manager at the sawmill where most of the men in Alcolu earned their living. George Burke Sr. was also the organizer of the search party that found the girls. On the day prior to the deceased girls' bodies being found, they rode past George and his sister Amy as they were out grazing the family cow near the train tracks that divided the town between the black and white communities. The two girls asked the brother and sister about where they could find some maypops, but the siblings couldn't help. George and his sister were among the last people to see the girls alive. George was promptly handcuffed and interrogated for hours in a small room without his parents, an attorney, or any witnesses. About a month after the girls' deaths, George Stinney Jr.'s trial began, but his court-appointed attorney did little to nothing to defend his client. By the time of his trial, Stinney hadn't seen his parents in weeks, and they were too afraid to attend the trial, so the 14-year-old was surrounded by his accusers and up to 1,500 strangers. The sheriff's claims that George confessed to the murders was never supported by evidence such as a written or signed statement. Amy, who could have provided her brother with an alibi, was not called to testify. At the end of a nearly 3-hour trial, the all-white all-men jury took just 10 minutes to find Stinney guilty of murder, with no recommendation for mercy. He was sentenced to die by electrocution. George's father was fired from his job and his family was forced to flee amidst threats on their lives. On June 16, 1944, George Stinney Jr. walked into the execution chamber at the South Carolina State Penitentiary in Columbia with a Bible tucked under his arm. He was 5 feet 1 inch tall and weighed just over 90 pounds. He was so small that the guards had difficulty strapping him to the electric chair, and during the electrocution, the jolt shook the adult-sized mask from his head. Decades later, local attorneys Matt Burgess and Steve McKenzie, who'd heard about Stinney's story, set out to clear his name. According to an article by Post and Courier, Burgess wondered, could a boy that small beat to death 2 girls, one of whom was roughly his size? Would he have had the strength to drag their bodies into a ditch? How could a black child living in the Jim Crow South commit such a brazen crime against 2 white girls in the middle of the afternoon without attracting attention? George's little sister finally got the chance to testify that she was with her brother when the murders occurred and that they had not been with the girls. In 2014, George's conviction was vacated by a circuit court judge, who noted that George had not received a fair trial and his Sixth Amendment constitutional rights had been violated. 70 years after he was put to death, little George Stinney Jr. was legally exonerated even though many still believe George was guilty, including the descendants of the girls murdered and those involved with the prosecution. So who was the murderer? According to the Post and Courier reports, it has long been rumored in the local town of Alcolu that the person who actually committed the murders of the 2 girls was 26-year-old George Burke Jr. His father was George Burke Sr., who owned the land on which the girls' bodies were found. Burke Sr. served as foreman of the coroner's inquest jury that recommended Stinney be held for murder, and he even served on the grand jury. Burke Jr. died 3 years later of complications from chronic kidney disease and allegedly confessed to the murders on his deathbed, but the remaining Burke family denies these rumors. Before his execution, George cried out to his cellmate Wilfred Hunter, "Why would they kill me for something I didn't do?" It's a question that George asked his cellmate over 70 years ago, but still haunts us to this day. It makes us wonder, why has the stereotypical notion of black men as criminals existed in American society for so many generations?